Hello there, Kate. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh,
And
thank you so much for having me. And it's so lovely to see you, Tess.
you too. And thank you to everyone who's joined us here today. We are discussing this gorgeous book, Searching for Charlotte, that Kate, you wrote with your sister Belinda about your great grandmother, Charlotte Waring, who was Australia's first ever children's author. Now, you grew up hearing about Charlotte from your maternal grandparents who told you wonderful stories about their grandparents while they drove you through the Australian countryside for weekend adventures. What was one of the stories they told you that made Charlotte such a fascinating figure for you when you were young?
Well, because I was a little girl who badly wanted to be a writer, of course, I loved the stories about how she came to write her book, which is called A Mother's Offering to Her Children by a Lady Long Resident in New South Wales. I also loved the whole romance of her story. We were told that she was hired to come out to Australia as a governess when she was a young woman. And there were all these other governesses who all applied for the job. But when they found out that they had to sail halfway around across the world to the colony of Sydney, they were all horrified and refused to come. And Charlotte, who was a very intrepid young woman, said, well, yes, I will come, but I must travel first class. And we used to think that was really feisty and clever of her. And then on her first day on the boat, a handsome young man came up the gangplank onto the ship, and then he tipped his hat to her, which was, as good as a wink. And 3 weeks later, they were engaged to be married. It was a whirlwind romance. And so, being a romantic girl, I loved the romance and the adventure of this story of her setting off to the colonies and finding her one true love.
Yes, it definitely, it sounds fiction, doesn't it? It doesn't sound like a true story. It's quite amazing that it was.
I mean, I must admit, when Belinda and I first set out to write this book, we, now being all grown up and serious, we thought, oh, surely these stories were romanticized and glamorized. Surely it wasn't quite as dangerous and romantic and such a struggle as we'd been brought up to believe. But in actual fact, we found that the true story was even more remarkable than we had imagined.
Oh, that's just wonderful. So you and Belinda and your brother, you grew up playing lots of imaginative games, and your own mother really encouraged writing in her children from a young age. What kinds of things did your mum do that nurtured your love of writing?
Well, we were all scribbling poems and stories and things from a very young age. And we were always writing plays and putting them on, getting dressed up and putting on the plays. And my long-suffering mother, would sit there and watch our endless plays, often with soft animals, over the back of the couch, and then she would applaud at the end. But she would ask us to write poems for her. She would say, for example, oh, it's your grandmother's birthday this week. Can you all make a card for her and write a poem for her? And so we would sit and draw and make cards and write poems in them and things like that, which, we always really loved to do. And I guess we lived in a house filled with books.
Yeah.
It was packed with books, and so we were always reading, and I think that was an important part of it as well.
Oh, that's absolutely wonderful. So after this really imaginative childhood and with published authors as ancestors, did you feel like it was almost written in the stars that you and your siblings would go on to become writers as well?
No, I don't think so. So I was the only one who wanted to be a writer. So Belinda wanted to be a vet. Our father was a vet, and we lived in a vet hospital when I was very, very young, like when I was a toddler. And then when I was about 5, we moved into a proper house, but my father still had a vet practice, and we spent a lot of our time with him at the vet hospital. And so Belinda was very keen on being a vet, and it wasn't really till she was in her final year of school that she gave up her dream. At that time, she'd studied science for her final exams.
Yeah.
And she then went on to a career as a professional writer. You know, she was a travel writer and a publicist, and worked various different companies writing. My brother, he has never really wanted to be a writer, though he writes all the time, and he's had about 24 books published, but he's a lawyer.
Yeah.
So it was me. I always knew I wanted to be a writer, and I was writing all the time, all through my childhood and all through my adolescence. I first tried to get published when I was 16, and I got a beautiful but firm rejection. Which broke my heart, completely broke my heart. And I kept on writing and kept on trying to be published. And my first book wasn't published until I was 30, which is 14 years after my first major rejection. Wow. So no, it never seemed written in the stars to me. It felt like I was crawling over broken glass.
Yeah, something you had to really work for.
Yeah, and I did. I worked very, very hard, and I never gave up on my dreams. So I've talked about this a lot with other writer friends, though, and they do think that the fact that I have writers in my heritage, that I knew I had writers, and it's not just Charlotte. There's a lot of others as well. So Charlotte's youngest daughter was Louisa Atkinson, who's the first Australian-born female author, and there were others, poets and things further back. Knowing that, subconsciously, it seemed like a possible dream for me.
Yes, something that
while
could
for
be
many writers, it seems impossible. And so I guess I was given permission to dream about being a writer. Still had to do the hard yards, though.
Yeah. And so you collaborated with your sister Belinda on this story. How did you decide who would write which parts of Charlotte's story?
Okay, so we'd often been asked if we would ever write together, because we've often toured together and done events together, and we'd always make a bit of a joke of it. I'd say, "Oh no, Belinda's too bossy." Belinda would say, "Oh no, Kate never does what she's told." But we never really actually considered it at all. When we decided to write this book together, it was because we knew the 180th anniversary of the publication of A Mother's Offering was coming up, and that was the year to do it. Yeah. You know, we might not be around in 20 years' time when it's a 200-year anniversary, and we might be, not willing to undertake such a huge, huge task. So it was now or never. So once we decided to do it, we went out for lunch somewhere really, really beautiful. We ordered a very expensive bottle of champagne. We got a pen and paper, and we drew up a rough chapter plan, like what the key points of Charlotte's life were, and we made it an equal number. Right. And then we simply went through the list and took turns in choosing what we wanted to write about. It was very, very easy, and very, very, it was kind of like Belinda would say, "Oh, I really want to, I really want to write the chapter about when she was a governess, because I've always wondered what that was like." And I went, "Okay, honey, you can do that, but I want to write the chapter where she actually writes a book and gets published." And Belinda would go, "Okay, honey, you can do that." And we're drinking champagne, we're talking and laughing, and we had it all ticked off fairly quickly. Which is how all major decisions should be made, I think.
Absolutely. That sounds like definitely the way forward. And did you end up sticking to those chapters that you initially picked?
Oh, absolutely. And we made a couple of rules. Like we kind of drew up a bit of a rule book for ourselves as well. So the first decision that we made was that we thought that we should write our own chapters in our own voices, that we wouldn't say we went here and we did this and we think that.
Yes.
Belinda would write her chapters as Belinda.
Yeah.
Kate and I went and did this, and I would write my chapters as Kate. Belinda and I thought this.
Yeah.
That was the first decision that we made, was that we would be completely in control of our own chapters, that the other person couldn't rewrite any parts of it or couldn't tell us what to do or how to do it. We had complete creative control over our own chapters. The other sister was allowed to do things like say, oh honey, I think you might have got those numbers wrong.
Right.
This terrible habit of transposing numbers, so I would keep writing 1841 as 1814 or something, and Vinny would go, oh, you got to swap the numbers around again, hun. And I would correct her grammar, being the grammar nerd that I am. But other than that, we had complete creative control, and I think it was really, really wise, because that meant that we weren't being hurt by the other person taking over and redoing our own work. And the other decision that we made is if we ever had any major disagreements, we'd drop the book before we allowed it to hurt our love for each other. So that's how we worked. We just divided the book up, and then we set to work on our own chapters. And then we only lived 5 minutes away from each other, so we were meeting, talking. This is before lockdown, when you were allowed to have dinner with your sister. And we would walk up and down the ocean front at Manly and talk. So we talked through a lot of the problems that we were having. And every now and again we disagreed over something that the other sister was doing. But because we'd made the rules quite clear, you were allowed to express your opinion, and then the other sister could either go, okay, I think you've got a point, I'll redress that, or they'll go, suck it up, honey, my chapter, I'm doing it my way. So that's how it worked.
That's really wonderful. And obviously you've come out of the other side with your relationship intact and probably stronger than ever.
Look, honestly, Belinda and I have always been so close. We live only 5 minutes away from each other. Our children have been brought up together. Our husbands are best mates. The first person I see when I finally get out of lockdown is going to be my sister.
Beautiful. That's wonderful.
And my mother.
Let's talk about Charlotte Waring. She was born in Georgian, England in 1796. I love that you discovered she was born halfway between Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte's birth dates. That has such a nice sense of fate to it, doesn't it, that she would also go on to be an author. And she grew up in a moneyed family. In fact, her Father Albert had his own private zoo in London. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, he did. And that was one of the childhood stories that we were brought up on. And being the imaginative child that I was, I thought that meant that he had like pet lions and tigers and heaps of like wonderfully wild and exotic animals like that. But it was more along the lines of peacocks and monkeys and parrots and strange beasts that he imported from other countries. It was very fashionable at the time. A lot of people did. There was Dante Gabriel Rossetti imported a kangaroo, for example, and had a pet kangaroo. So
amazing.
Yeah.
And then sadly Charlotte's quite idyllic childhood took a very tragic turn when she was very young. What happened?
So we don't know quite what happened, but it was during the Napoleonic Wars, and after Napoleon was beaten and sent into exile, there was a big bank crash in London, and so we think it's quite likely that her father lost all of his money. So Charlotte was had to go out and start earning her income as a governess when she was only 14. Which we didn't realise how young she was. We knew that she had started being a governess when she was only a very young woman, but 14 is very young. When Belinda and I travelled to the UK to do our research there, we took our daughters with us, and my daughter Ella was then 14, and the idea of sending my little baby out to live in some strange house and to look after and teach someone else's children, and how vulnerable she would be and how lonely and frightened she would be, it just really brought the predicament that Charlotte was in so vividly to life for me. And, you know, I'll admit I wept a few tears over the thought of it. Because Charlotte came very much to life in our imaginations in the 2.5 years that we spent researching her life.
Yeah, I think, and I read that your daughter Ella was at the same age of that you just said as Charlotte being a governess, was frolicking in the same gardens where she had actually worked. That's quite a surreal thing.
It was.
As well.
So I want you to imagine my 14-year-old daughter in her ripped jeans doing cartwheels. Barefoot on the grass, and then imagine what Charlotte would have been like in her little demure dark gown and her little bonnet, sitting there like this, you know, not being allowed to run or play or definitely not turn cartwheels. And that was really poignant as well. That really brought home to me how, you know, how much life has changed for young women now.
Yeah.
The freedoms.
Absolutely. And at that age, Charlotte had lost her own mother, hadn't she?
Yeah, Charlotte's mother died when she was only a very, very little girl. So died in childbirth, giving birth to Charlotte's younger sister. So she'd never had a mother. And as was common in those days, she was sent off to be raised by an aunt. So she lost her father as well as her mother.
Yeah, that's so sad. And I also thought something that was very interesting was that you wrote that Charlotte was sent off to boarding school, which was actually a sign that her father's fortunes were failing. Whereas now, if you were off in boarding school in London, it's the Eton and the elites that do that. But it wasn't like that at the time, was it?
Not for girls, no. Well, there weren't any girl, any real good, highly regarded schools for girls in those time. Just think about the Bronte sisters who were sent off to that awful school which you now see, you know, immortalized in Jane Eyre. And you know, while we were writing this book, both Belinda and I read a lot of Bronte sisters again, just to, you know, help us imagine what it must have been like for Charlotte, who was in a very similar situation, obviously having to go to boarding school and then having to make a living from a very young age as a governess for a pittance.
Yes, and that would seem like a slap in the face to any girl that had started her life in a wealthy family to then have to work as a governess. But Charlotte didn't see it that way, did she? She wasn't very upset at the job.
Well, we don't know, because there's no record of her own thoughts and feelings on the occasion. All we can say with any authority is that she accepted her fate and she did the best with what she'd been given. The earliest record that we have of her own inner life, if you like, was the journal that she began when she sailed from Britain to Australia in 1826, when she was 30. But, you know, she certainly shows a lot of spirit, and she's very light-hearted, and she is excited about the adventure. So from that, we extrapolate that she was quite intrepid and resilient. But she was 30 by that time, not 14.
Right, yes. So it still might have been quite a traumatic experience for her at 14.
I can't see how it could not have been.
Yeah. And when you were in the UK, you say she came to life for you when you were there. Was there a moment that stood out when you were researching her early life, when you were there with your sister and daughters?
I think when we were walking in her footsteps, you know, so and that was Belinda's part of the research. Belinda was working on her childhood and adolescence, and so, you know, going and seeing the places where she had worked, imagining that she'd walked in the same path that we were now walking in, seeing the church that she used to go to on a Sunday, you know, walking around. Mary Wollstonecraft is buried in the graveyard of the church where Charlotte used to go with her, you know, with the family that she was working for every Sunday. And so we like to imagine that she would wander through the graveyard and perhaps pick a flower and lay it on Mary Wollstonecraft's grave, just like we did. And they hopefully read a vindication of the rights of women, and that put the fire, in her belly to raise young, strong, well-educated young women. Because of course she was a great educator, and she went on and ended up founding a school in Sydney. So she felt very passionately about the importance of educating women, which was most unfashionable at the time.
Yes, I can imagine. So at 30, she's done this huge leap of accepting this governess job across the seas in New South Wales. What do you imagine motivated her to leave everything behind and start anew in Australia?
Well, I tell the story of her journey as an oral storytelling performance often. In actual fact, that's what led us to decide to write the book, because I told her story at an event one night, or Belinda and I told her story together. And I always say that, she dreamt of a life, an independent life, a self-determined life, that, she wanted to start afresh and build a life where, she was free.
Yeah.
So I think that's true.
Yeah. And it just, I guess it afforded her that opportunity to just create the life she wanted, leaving everything else behind.
Yeah.
Do you know what possessions she would have taken on board with her on that ship?
She wouldn't have been able to take very much. So we don't know exactly what she took. But, Belinda did the research on those chapters, and she read the diaries and letters of many other women who immigrated around the same time. The ship that she travelled on was chartered by the MacArthurs and the Atkinson and James Atkinson, the man she married. And so it was crammed to the brim with sheep and horses and dogs and bags of seeds. They were filling up the ship with what they needed to make their fortune in the colonies. And so she would not have been allowed to bring very much at all. She would have travelled in a very small cabin, which she shared with one of the other women. So she would have been allowed maybe one trunk.
Right. Okay. And that was first class too, was it?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And so James Atkinson, the young man who tipped his hat to her and went on to become her husband, can you tell us a little bit about him and what led him to Charlotte?
I can indeed. So James Atkinson was born in Kent around the same time that Charlotte was born, and they lived very close to each other without knowing each other. He and his brother immigrated to Australia and were given sizable land grants in what's the southern highlands of New South Wales, which is beautiful green kind of rolling pastures and hills. And they set up a farm there. He had travelled back to Great Britain, both to buy all the sheep and the other stock, but also to publish a book. So he actually wrote the first book ever published about life in the colonies. Wow. It has the extremely engaging title of An Account of the State of Agriculture and Grazing in New South Wales. But it was like a guidebook. It was like, people who were moving to Australia would buy it and study it and then would know what to pack, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And he actually went on and wrote a great many other books as well. So he was a writer as well. And so it was obviously a match made in heaven.
Yeah. And they did have that very fast whirlwind romance. Now that was quite against the convention of the time, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was quite scandalous. The woman who had hired Charlotte to come out, she was to be a governess for the MacArthur family. So not for John MacArthur, the famous Merino man, but his brother Hannibal MacArthur. But they all were part of a very close clan. Her name was Mrs. King, and she was quite horrified because she paid a lot of money to bring Charlotte out. And a bit of a wedge was driven between the MacArthurs and the Atkinsons as a result of that.
Right.
Or so we had always thought, but in actual fact, we found that it was probably a bit dramatized.
Okay.
Yeah, because Charlotte, worked as a governess there for a year before she married, and all of her MacArthur students remembered her with great warmth and affection, and they wrote to each other for many years afterwards, which doesn't sound like much of a rift at all, does it?
And so shortly after arriving in Australia, she's married James. What would life have been like for Charlotte in those early years of marriage and child rearing?
Bloody hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they, to begin with, they were just living in like a little cottage on this, land grant, which was quite a long way away from Sydney. There wasn't much down there yet. Over time, more people moved down there, and that church was built and a little village was built. But, to go and visit someone would have been a day's ride. She, the estate was worked by convict labour. And, they had, of course, displaced the local Indigenous people who were left with very little. And so, they worked quite hard to try and help the lives of the local Indigenous people. But that, that would have been an extra concern for them. And it would have been lonely. There weren't very many women in the neighborhood at that time. And the bush was filled with bushrangers.
Yeah, so it's very different life to her city life in London.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I loved reading that they actually, James and Charlotte, developed pretty strong friendships with the Indigenous people there, which they were quite progressive, weren't they? Because that wasn't something that was commonly done at the time.
No, they were actually criticised for being too soft. And James Atkinson actually wrote to the governor, who was, I think, Macquarie at that time, to express his feelings of distress about the state of care of the local Indigenous people, and saying that there had been a sharp drop in their population, and asking for more help for them, more food and clothes, and asking that the local leader was rewarded because he was such a good man, and he worked very, very closely with James to look after the local Indigenous people. Then his daughter, Louisa Atkinson, wrote many, many, many books, and she was a journalist as well, many articles about it. And she was one of the first to really talk about stolen land and really write a kind of investigative journalistic piece on the damage done to the local Indigenous people, and calling for for more help, and trying to whip up some outrage. She was also the first person to talk about using native plants in cooking, and she used to publish recipes using lemon myrtle and things like that. So she was a campaigner for Indigenous rights in the mid 19th century. That's very unusual.
Incredible. Yeah, that's quite incredible. You've visited the house that James built for Charlotte when they were wed. What's Oldberry like?
Oh, it's beautiful. So when we were little girls, we used to go and spend the weekends with our grandparents, and we would go down, and Oldberry had been lying derelict for quite a long time, and it was like this, it's a beautiful kind of sandstone colonial structure, but it was all overgrown. The garden was all wild, and there was this kind of thorny hedge. So we always used to think it was kind of like Sleeping Beauty's castle, and would peer through through the rose briars, and all we could get was glimpses of the house. And we all used to imagine making our fortune and buying back the house and restoring it, because it had been lost after James's death. But it was bought quite a few years ago. It actually was the largest, like the most expensive property ever sold in the Southern Highlands. And the man who bought it has devoted his life to restoring it and restoring the gardens. And he's done an awful lot of research into what was planted there at the time. And he's tried to restore the orchards and it's an absolutely magnificent mansion now. And, still can't quite see myself being able to restore it to the family quite yet. Got to sell a few more books, but it is absolutely magnificent.
Yeah.
We were able to go and have a look at it. We were invited to a cocktail party there by the owner, which was tremendously exciting for us. And we took our mother. Belinda cried.
Oh,
because we'd never been there before.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a happy outcome too, that it found a loving person to restore it so beautifully as well.
Yeah, that's right, because so many houses like that end up being knocked down, bulldozed, and modern monstrosities built in their place. So yeah.
Oh, that's lovely. Charlotte's life took another tragic turn when James died in 1834. He left her widowed with 4 small children. So here she was with this huge property to her name, not much farming knowledge. Most of her employees are convicts. How did she cope?
Well, the first thing to realise is that it was not left to her, because women weren't permitted to inherit property in those days. It was left in trust to her son,
right,
who we call James John Atkinson, because to differentiate himself from his father James Atkinson and his uncle John Atkinson, they all have the same names. So James John was only a little boy. He was only like about 4 or 5. Louisa, who I've spoken about, she was a newborn baby. So she was never held in her father's arms. She never knew her father. He died when she was only a few weeks old. So Charlotte struggled on as best that she could. She had to manage the house and the property and the staff and, vast flocks of sheep. She worked very closely with her overseer, but after James had been the district magistrate, and after his death, it became very, very lawless, and there were a lot of very violent attacks. And so one of the women who worked on the estate was raped by bush rangers, and many people were held up and robbed, and many were killed. There was a particularly violent bushranger there. His name was John Lynch, and he was called the Berrima Axe Murderer. He's actually Australia's worst serial murderer. And John Lynch attacked Charlotte and her overseer one day when they were riding out in the bush. They whipped the overseer, so they tore off his clothes and then whipped his back till it was nothing but bloody rags. And we don't know what happened to Charlotte that day, because she never wrote about it or spoke about it. But we suspect that she was a victim of violence herself. 3 weeks later, she married the overseer, the man who'd been whipped, and he ended up being a violent drunk, and she suffered domestic violence at his hands for the next few years, until she packed up and ran away. So she packed up her 4 children, who were then all under the age of, I think, 11, and fled and left him there. And
that wouldn't have been something that would be easy to do at that time.
No. I mean, they were on horseback.
Yeah.
So they left at dawn before he rode, and they rode from, they rode down the ravine of the Shoalhaven River, so which is dizzyingly high. Like, you know, we went there in a like a Land Rover, and I was terrified. You know, the roads like this,
let alone on horseback.
And they, you know, they had to sleep out, you know, around a campfire. They had to find their own food. She lived in a small little wooden shack for 9 months, and then eventually made her way to Sydney. But she had nothing. She had no money. She had no legal recourse. She could not divorce him. Yeah. Only lords and kings got to divorce their unwanted partners, and then it cost them a fortune. It had to be passed by the Crown. On her marriage, everything she owned became his. Yeah. So he had everything. Yeah. It was a terrible, terrible time to be a woman.
Yeah. And it shows you how desperate she was to get away, that she was prepared to give everything up and have nothing left.
Yeah, that's right. And for, you know, 4 small children, you know, they left with their clothes on their back, what they could carry, and then they had a bullock dray. So, which was like, you know, a cart pulled by a couple of bullocks. So they had a few sticks of furniture and a couple of suitcases, and their pet koala.
Can't leave without the koala.
No.
And was it a given that she would retain custody of her children if women didn't have many rights back?
Oh, of course not. No woman was allowed to keep custody of her own children. So Charlotte actually, the trustees of her son's estate actually had the court appoint a guardian and tried to take her children away from her. So the guardian that the court appointed was in his early 20s, had newly arrived in the colonies and had never met the children. So they thought that, you know, I mean, my sons, I've got 2 sons, aged 24 and 21. There's no way in hell I'd leave them in charge of 4 small children. They'd starve. Yeah. Anyway, Charlotte utterly refused to give up her children, and she actually took the trustees to court, and she battled them through the New South Wales Supreme Court for the next 4 or 5 years. And she eventually won custody of her own children. It's a landmark case for women's rights, not only in Australia, but in the world. It was only the 3rd time that a woman had ever been awarded custody of her own children under British law.
Incredibly courageous person.
Yeah. And she was only tiny, you know, like she was a little pocket rocket. So I wrote all those chapters, and I had, of course, grown up on this story. I knew that law students sometimes study it at university. My brother studied it when he was doing law.
Oh, isn't that amazing?
So I knew the story of it, but writing that chapter, I found it really, really, really moving, and actually made me angry. I had not realized that was the law back then, that it was taken for granted that the women would always lose their children.
Just incredible. And it was during this really harrowing time that somehow Charlotte found the time and the inclination to write. What was her motivation there? Well,
again, we can only infer, we can only speculate, because there's no written account. Yeah. But I think there were a couple of reasons. One, I think it was very, very important that she make some money.
Yeah.
Because she had nothing, absolutely nothing, and the cost of this court battle was immense. At one point, her solicitor said to the court, "The children are literally starving." The trustees were told to pay her the money that was owed to her from her first husband's will, and they never really did. So she was really, really desperately poor, and had to find some way to make money, which was not easy for a woman in the 18 1820s,
Yeah.
1840s. I think the other reason was that she had always loved to write. So, you know, there's evidence that she wrote other stories and poems. She wrote her journal. There's a beautiful poem that she transcribed in her journal. So it, you know, she was like we were when we were kids, always scribbling.
Yeah.
So it was something I think that she felt she could do.
Yeah.
Thirdly, she was hoping to open up a school for girls, and she needed capital to open up the school. And so, having had written a book that was going to, you know, show her intelligence, would have been a good advertisement for her.
Right.
But thirdly, I think it was just because she was telling she was homeschooling her children all this time. And so I think that she was writing lessons for them, and she was telling them stories and then writing those stories down. So she had the material to hand.
Yeah. Yeah. And so Charlotte's children's book, A Mother's Offering to Her Children, became the first children's book in Australia to be published. Did it make her rich and famous?
Well, it certainly didn't make her famous because it was published anonymously. A Mother's Offering to Her Children by Lady Long, resident in New South Wales, which was the cultural norm at the time. But also, I think it was because she was a bit of she had a tarnished reputation because of the bushranger attack and the court case and everything else. You know, the failed marriage. So it certainly didn't make her famous. In actual fact, no one knew who had written A Mother's Offering till the 1980s. No one except the family. We all knew, but the greater world didn't know. Did it make her rich? No. She would have been paid a one-off payment.
Right.
So she wouldn't have earned royalties, and the book would only probably have had one print run. Again, we don't know. I examined what was happening to the, you know, books by other women that were being published at that time. Jane Austen was actually one of the first women to negotiate a royalty rate, so that she earned a percentage of the sales rather than a flat fee. And she was publishing a good 20 years after our Charlotte.
Yeah. And what was the book about?
A Mother's Offering to Her Children is a series of conversations between a mother and her 4 children, who bear a remarkable likeness to her own 4 children, being of the same sex, ages, and their names beginning with the same alphabet, with the same letter of the alphabet. She is basically using these conversations as a framing device to teach the children different lessons about geology, geography, history, you know, what was happening in the world at the time. It had a pedagogical function in that it was designed to be taught, you know, as a teaching tool, so that people would buy it and then they could read it to their children and their children would learn. She talks about dinosaurs, even though the word dinosaur hadn't been invented yet. And it was the first book to describe Australian flora and fauna and Australian history. The first time that anyone wrote a story that had the shipwreck of Eliza Fraser in it, for example. You know, it was designed for children in the colony.
Right, amazing. She endured even more suffering, Charlotte, in her lifetime. After that, she lost her daughter and a grandchild. What happened there? Do we know?
Oh yes, you know, of course we know. So one's life is, you know, tends to always keep on being tumultuous and tempestuous after the event. So her eldest daughter, who was our great grandmother, she married when she was only 19 and had a very hard life. Her second daughter, Emily, married but then died in childbirth. And then her youngest daughter, Louisa, married. This is actually after Charlotte's death, but married, had a baby, and then her husband got thrown from the saddle of his horse, and the horse galloped home, and Louisa saw the horse come in with, an empty saddle, and had a heart attack and fell dead. And so when her husband finally staggered in after having to walk miles home, he found his baby, his newborn baby, screaming in the cradle, and his wife lying dead on the floor.
Oh my gosh.
Very tragic.
Have you considered telling Louisa's story, which sounds like a phenomenal story as well?
People have asked us that. At the moment, it's not something that we're seriously considering, partly because we tell Louisa's story in Searching for Charlotte anyway.
Charlotte's, yeah.
And also because the difference is Louisa Atkinson is well studied and well documented, and there are quite a few books written about her. Obviously being the first Australian-born female novelist makes her of interest to academics, and also she has quite a large body of work. She wrote for her living from the time she was 19 to the day of her death. While the author of Australia's first children's book was a mystery for so long, because Charlotte published anonymously. It was really only until the 1980s that she was identified by Marcy Muir, a bibliographer of Australian children's literature. And so she's only had like the last few decades of people being interested in her. And so much of her writings and her life was lost. Yeah. So hopefully now that we have done all the work,
open the floodgates.
and hopefully, I mean, there are still some holes in what we know about her life, and maybe those mysteries will be answered one day.
Yeah. Kate, how did Charlotte see out her years once her children were grown?
So Louisa lived with her until Charlotte's death. Louisa had always had a weak heart, and so mother and daughter lived with each other and looked after each other. Charlotte opened a school for girls, and she was a passionate advocate for the importance of education for women. I think that she lived out her life, surrounded by love and family, and until she died.
Oh, that's a nice ending for such a tumultuous life that she had. And she's done some, I mean, you were telling me earlier that the cover of the book is all Charlotte's illustrations as well. She was an amazing artist as well as being a brilliant writer. Now we know your family is full of writers. Are you all artists as well? Has that been passed down the family?
There are quite a few artists in the family. So one of our cousins is an artist by trade, and absolutely wonderful artist. Amongst our children, there are a lot of people who paint and draw for pleasure. We all love to draw. We just don't have much talent. But it's always interesting how things work out in genetic inheritance, isn't it? Who gets what?
Absolutely. And there's quite an amazing connection between your family now and Charlotte's, some 200 years ago. She was raised, her children were raised partly by the stepfather. You guys were raised partly by a stepfather as well. And she had the 3 girls and a boy. And up until recently, you thought you were 2 girls and a boy, but you made a startling discovery. And it was during this research, wasn't it, that it
was, it was an incredible surprise, a shock. So while we were writing this book, so when Belinda and I began to write this book, our big fear was that there was nothing new to find. And our big fear was that our lives are so boring, writing the memoir, was just going to bore people to tears. You know, what do we do except read and write, really? But of course, life has a way of throwing you big surprises. And so we were halfway through the writing of this book when we discovered that my father had another daughter that we had never known about, that, you know, she had never really been part of his life. She had been raised by her mother, but my father knew about her, knew that she existed, but had never told us. She had known about us. She actually grew up only about half an hour away from where we lived, but we had never known. So can I tell you that the day that my sister rang me to tell me that I had a sister I had never known about, it was not what the conversation I was expecting to have when I heard my phone ring. So it was a major shock. It really rattled our sense of what we knew about our family and our father. And then my father was not keen on us getting to know our sister because, you know, he was worried about the consequences of that. But we tracked her down, we found her, and, you know, up until lockdown, we were seeing her all the time. But of course, we've been in and out of lockdown now for more than a year. So we haven't seen as much of her as we would have liked in the past year.
Yeah. Oh, that's just wonderful, though, that you have brought her into the family fold. And
yeah, that's right. And it really was such a surprise because the parallels between the lives of Charlotte's children and us had already been interesting, but that was really surprising to know that we had the same pattern of symptoms.
Yeah. Kate, you've had such a wonderful and varied career. We've got memoir and fiction and fairy tales. Can you share with us what's next for you?
I always have a lot going on. So next year I have 3 books being published with 3 different publishers. So the first one is a children's book. I'll show you. Actually, I've got it right here. This is my proof copy. So this is called The Gardener's Son and the Golden Birds and Other Tales of Gentle Young Men.
That's an incredible cover. That's just
beautiful. My illustrator, Lorena, is just a genius. I love working with her so much. So basically, every year we do a book like this. It's a collection of 7 unjustly forgotten fairy tales. I retell them and she illustrates them. I'm just going to see if I can find a beautiful illustration for you. See?
Oh, it's just
amazing. So what Lorena does is she walks out in the world and she finds things, leaves, flowers, petals, stones, sticks, bones, stones. Yeah. And then she photographs them and then she creates a montage of 1,000 small elements and creates something really magical out of them. So that's coming out in March with Serenity Press, which is a Perth-based publishing house that specialises in folklore and fairy tale. Then in July, I have my next novel coming out with Penguin. So historical fiction for adults. It's set in Crete during World War II. Yeah, so it's a story of a love triangle set during the resistance, in the resistance to the Nazi occupation, 1941 to 1945. So I'm actually hard at work on that now, doing a round of cutting and editing.
Yeah.
Then in October or maybe November, I have a collection of poems being published. They're not, some are poems and some are creative reflections and some are snippets of writing out of my books or out of my diaries. And I've been working with the artist Wendy Sharp, who's this absolutely incredible Sydney-based artist. She's won the Ultra Board and she has this incredibly wild, sexy, vivid, art. And so that is again being published by a Perth publisher, Terry Ann White at Upswell. So 3 very, very different books, poetry,
Wow.
fiction, and fairy tale retellings, all coming out in the same year. And
A
what am I
lady of
working on?
time.
I'm working on book 5 in this series at the moment. And I'm doing the early research for a new novel, which will come out in 2 years' time.
Wow, okay, that is a jam-packed schedule.
Yeah, I'm pretty busy.
Oh.
I won't deny it. I won't pretend. You can't get much busier.
Oh, well, it was just fascinating hearing all about Charlotte's life. Thank you for bringing it to the masses and sharing it with us and doing all the hard work so that her story could be told, because it's such a wonderful story, and it's great that it's out there now for people to be able to study her. And I wish you all the very best with all the projects that you've got lined up. 2022 is going to be a huge year for you.
Thank you so much, Tess. Yes, it's going to be a happy year, though. These are all projects that I've been so happy writing and have poured so much myself into. And it'll be my first year without any children at school. So hopefully that will mean I'll have more time.
Oh, fantastic. And hopefully no lockdowns, and you're out and about doing in-person events and meeting your readers and all of that next year too.
I hope so.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks, Tess.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. See you later. Bye.